So we're going to try something a bit ambitious today and cover Plato's Republic in a single episode. If I sound a bit congested, I'm recovering from being sick, so pardon me for that. If you've ever taken a philosophy class, you've certainly read some of Plato's Republic, or maybe all of it, and yet for all of its influence, the familiar experience to so many of us upon encountering Plato's opus is a sense of alienation. Because in this text we find a call to censor art and poetry, we find a plan to eliminate private property and share everything in common. We find democracy rated as of third or fourth rate value in comparison to forms of government, which are based on what amounts to a caste system. And finally, we're confronted with the strange claim, as strange in the Athens of Socrates' time as it is to us, that justice is achieved when everything is in its proper place, when everyone is attending to their proper business, that it doesn't necessarily have to do with giving every man his due, or it isn't just de facto whatever the state says, but that justice is everything in its proper place, and that the proper place for the philosopher is the seat of the throne, as the ruler of all society, or perhaps, comprising a very small caste of the wisest philosophers. That this is, in fact, the ideal state, and that rule by oligarchs or a military class or even by the people is sort of a degenerate form of government in comparison to this, which in Plato's ideal is the rule of reason, basically, that corresponds in physical, actual reality to the rule of the philosopher. Now, these claims confront students of philosophy from all ages as profoundly off-putting, which I think has a wonderful function all its own, right? Because Plato's Republic makes people raise questions for the first time about values and ideas that, maybe most students would initially take for granted, such as the idea that art and ideas ought not to be censored. And, if you just take that for granted, that's one thing, but if you actually have to formulate your reasoning for the value that you hold, which in matter of fact, values you hold, you probably just inherited from your parents, right? Or from the culture at large. So Plato's Republic makes us question some of those. But the even more exquisite aspect of it is how these shocking conclusions that Socrates has, they're arrived at so smoothly via a dialogue between Socrates and all the various interlocutors, such that before the audience even realizes it, they've already acquiesced to terms which make inevitable the curious claims that, this strange state presented by Socrates, this place ruled by philosophers where everything is shared in common, including children, by the way, completely at odds with our own way of life in almost every aspect. Before you know it, Socrates has gotten you to acquiesce to all these points that actually prove, as far as he argues, that this description of the ideal state is actually the ideal that you should hold. Somehow he convinces his interlocutors to agree with these claims. And in his persuasiveness, he sort of, I think, challenges us moderns yet again. Now, the first thing that we should say, because this is the political philosophy season of the podcast, is that the Republic isn't just a political text. It is, in fact, it's framed first and foremost as a moral text. It's a study of how one lives justly and how one can manifest justice in their own lives. And so it begins actually with an inquiry as to what justice is, and then into whether or not a just man is happier than the unjust man. When we use the term justice here, right, we're speaking of a concept which is not perfectly translatable to modern English, because justice, it's something that one manifests within his character in the context that Socrates is talking about it, just as justice would be manifest within a society. We might say that justice is synonymous with doing right, whether as an individual or as a society. And so justice here could also refer to morality in some sense. So it's not just I suppose I'm saying that we tend to think of justice as somewhat of a abstract moral concept, but it's something that is embodied within your own actions. And it doesn't just involve justice in the sense of legal justice or in the sense of fairness, but in always taking the correct moral action. is to sort of live as a just man. The main discourse of the Republic begins when one of the men that Socrates is discoursing with, Polemarchus, invokes Simonides, saying that justice is giving everyone their due. And Socrates claims to not understand this remark, as it's sort of clouded over with the vagueness of poets. Because obviously, Simonides cannot mean that if one had borrowed a sword from a good friend of theirs, and then one day, your friend comes over and he's gone completely insane, and he's asking for his sword back so he can go chop people up with it, it would not be a just or a right action, however you want to translate it, to give him back his sword. So, of course, Polemarchus agrees with this. That can't be what Simonides meant, right? But then Socrates sort of presses him, well, what did he mean? What does it mean to give every man his due? For someone to possess the quality of justice, how does that differentiate him from the unjust person? To answer these questions and to answer attacks from one of the other interlocutors, Thrasymachus, Socrates says that he must bring the argument to a larger scale. He says, quote, "Let us suppose we are rather short-sighted men and are set to read some small letters at a distance. One of us then discovers the same letters elsewhere on a larger scale and larger surface. Won't it be a godsend to us to be able to read the larger letters first and then compare them with the smaller to see if they are the same?" "Certainly," replied Adeimantus. "But what bearing has this on our inquiry about what is just?" "I will tell you. Justice can be a characteristic of an individual or of a community, can it not?" "Yes." "And a community is larger than an individual." "It is." "We may therefore find justice on a larger scale in the larger entity, and so easier to recognize. I accordingly propose that we start our inquiry with the community and then proceed to the individual and see if we can find in the conformation of the smaller entity anything similar to what we have found in the larger." "That seems a good suggestion," he agreed. "Well then," Socrates said, "if we were to look at a community coming into existence, we might be able to see how justice and injustice originate in it." End quote. And so Socrates makes it clear here that the political program laid out is in some sense an analogy. It's a metaphor. It is perhaps a poetical explanation of how one must order the self, right? Ironically, because Socrates is always critical of the vagueness of poets, but here he's using metaphor, right, which is sort of the domain of poetry. But, the way one would order the self, order the psyche constituted of its many drives. The ideal city that Socrates conjures is simply a pedagogical tool for talking about virtue. And so the level of interpretation of the Republic as a discussion of the ideal state is in some sense only the exoteric meaning. And that the esoteric meaning, its inner meaning, the deeper meaning, would interpret it solely through the lens of how the ideal city compares to or elucidates the challenge of achieving justice, or we might say right action, correct character in one's own life. Socrates notes near the end of the text a number of times that it's very likely that their ideal city could not possibly be created on earth, and that the creation of such an ideal social system is so unlikely, it has so many factors aligned against its creation that we should never expect it to emerge in human history. And so we might look as a guiding light, sort of in interpreting the Republic, to the model of the forms, right, which appears within the text. We could look to the ideal city-state so described as Plato's form of the city, right, and that all the governments which are possible to realize are mere approximations of this ideal, which any wise person would realize cannot be fully reached, just as all the Platonic forms are the ideal patterns after which all the things in the world are only sort of imitations or approximations. As Socrates says in the dialogue, they are, quote, "trying to create in words the pattern of a good state," end quote. And the word for pattern is paradigma. And you might recognize in that word the etymological origin of our own word, paradigm, which is also elucidating to how to think of the forms. Now, I think it's important to bring up this aspect of the work as grounded in ethical philosophy as its first concern, because Plato's Republic has been blamed for many great political evils and crimes. Of course, we don't tend to blame it for the horror show of the Middle Ages when I mean, aristocracies ruled. There was plenty of blood spilled in the pursuit of grand political projects by prideful kings. And it was a time when Plato's student Aristotle basically dominated the ideology of the academy throughout Europe. Plato and Aristotle tend to get a pass for all that, and the blame is usually sort of fixed with Christianity or just with basic human depravity. But when it comes to the crimes of the 20th century, something about the industrial, bureaucratic, systematic nature of the genocides and the mass killings really, I think, confronted us and demanded a new explanation. And I suppose I'm saying we tend to look for philosophical culprits for what happened, or they've been among one of the lists of things that people have pointed the finger at. And of course, the culprits for all the crimes of the communists are Marx and Engels, sometimes Rousseau. I think Will Durant even blamed Voltaire for the French Revolution. And, obviously, anyone you can blame the French Revolution for, you could also blame communist revolutions on them. The blame for fascist crimes was largely pinned on Nietzsche. But there was one philosopher who, quite notably, blamed both of them on Plato, right? Both the communists and the fascists, and that was Karl Popper. Now, it's become popular, I think, in recent years for a number of reasons to sort of bash on Karl Popper these days, but let's take a charitable view of Popper so that we can kind of credibly deal with his argument. Popper was from Vienna, and he was Jewish. He was lower middle class. He worked very hard toward a scholarly career without the aristocratic origins or financial backing of, for example, his famous rival Wittgenstein. I'm not sure if Wittgenstein considered Popper a rival, but I think Popper certainly considered Wittgenstein someone he had his sort of guns aimed at. And of course, they had their famous dispute in a very short meeting in person. Now, after the Anschluss, Popper had to flee from the Nazis and uproot his entire life, right, under the threat of being exterminated. And so he experienced firsthand what could happen if violent or extreme ideas were allowed to take hold within an ostensibly democratic system. And so when he wrote The Open Society and Its Enemies, he was concerned with providing a solid philosophical grounding for what he called open societies, which basically means in historical terms, the liberal democratic West, such that our society could recognize these threats and could thereby preserve ourselves against them should they arise again, right? In Plato, Popper sees, first and foremost, an anti-democratic philosopher, one who would instill a censorious regime and slot every citizen into a rigid place within a hierarchical society according to the judgment of a class of aristocratic, elite leaders. Personal freedom is of little regard in the ideal state that Socrates describes. And when Socrates does talk about democracy and describe the democratic character, he describes democratic freedom as necessarily accompanied by a lack of discipline and the inability to discern the difference between what is necessary to pursue and what isn't. In other words, the text expresses a distrust in the ability of the people as a mass to make the correct decisions. In Plato, therefore, Popper sees the precedent established for all anti-democratic ideas in the future. Whether Plato directly influences the later authoritarians or not, after Plato, there forever persists this idea that the people, guided by undisciplined whims and easily manipulated emotions and so on and so forth, can't be trusted to rule. Even more damningly, the political project of the Republic is, in Popper's interpretation, utopian. He sees in Plato the common origin of communism and fascism, and in fact every project of political ambition, insofar as it is utopian, and, he sort of, the aspect that he goes after is that it's an attempt to seek to suspend individual rights and freedoms in favor of a grand, perfect system. And so in both his work, Open Society and Its Enemies, and in Poverty of Historicism, he charges that Plato's vision is, quote, utopian social engineering, which he says, quote, has led only to the use of violence in the place of reason, end quote. So to attempt to overcome the limitations of human beings and impose this perfect order, that will always require the use of force, right? Because the very argument that the people don't know what's good for them sort of presupposes the idea that you're going to have to make them do what's good for them, which is going to mean using force, right? Because if they're not intelligent enough to be persuaded, then you're going to have to use violence. And so to Popper, the history of the 20th century demonstrated that this type of thinking was a hazard to the open society, as he called it, that the anti-democratic idea can gain traction nevertheless on the very democratic energy provided by such a system, right? That's the other sort of danger, that if democracies didn't protect themselves against this sort of meme of the unfitness of the people to rule, they would eventually be subverted. Now, Popper's broader argument's not really our interest here, but his characterization of Plato, I think, demands an answer because Popper sort of, I suppose I'm using him to stand in for the voice of modernity and the moral argument that you would make against Plato. And I think he phrases not only the best argument in this regard, but it's also the strongest. It's the most provocative one, right? Is Plato to blame for the totalitarian visions of 20th century regimes? And is Plato a utopian? For the first question, I would just say personally, just as a matter of taste, I find it kind of strange that we always want to dredge up people's corpses to morally charge them with the deaths of people centuries after, they lived, right? It's like the Catholic Church putting the Pope on trial after he's dead. But I suppose if I'm to be charitable and consider the question in terms of whether, could the content of philosophy works that somebody leaves behind be regarded as dangerous, whether or not we want to morally condemn Plato or put Plato on trial, could we just say, objectively speaking, whether or not his work is dangerous? And I would say, yes, it is dangerous, actually. But perhaps ironically, I think, ironic given Popper's position, I think the Republic itself advances the argument that works of poetry or literature which could be dangerous to the harmony or unity of society, or which present mad or absurd notions, or excite emotions to unhelpful or counterproductive or dangerous states of mind, that these should all be prohibited, right? And so, funnily enough, Karl Popper is appealing to the same reasoning contained within Plato's Republic in regarding Plato's Republic as dangerous. For him to be consistent, I think he has to be able to trust in the people's capacity to be reasonable, at least reasonable enough to preserve the open society, right? Because if they don't have that capacity, his project is undermined, and we have to resort to censoring ideas because of the effect they might have in the minds of the populace. And then at that point, we have to admit that Plato was correct. So that's sort of a catch-22 for Karl Popper, and I don't want to see anyone bring up the paradox of intolerance because that's a very, very silly argument. Maybe you can argue that it's correct to be intolerant. I mean, really, it's the same thing we've just been talking about. It's correct to censor certain ideas because they're too dangerous. But once you take that position, you're actually going out of the open society and into Plato's Republic. You're taking a step towards Plato's Republic. So whether or not you think that's a good thing, that is what you're doing. And there's no way out of that situation. Sorry. Now, the question of greater interest to me personally is whether or not we class the Republic as utopian. The strongest argument against this is that the discussion begins and ends with an ethical grounding, as we've mentioned. And the parable that Socrates tells at the end of the tale, it emphasizes our individual human choice and the need to ceaselessly pursue justice in our own lives. And yet we must remember, as Nietzsche might perhaps remind us, that our own lives are not independent from the other lives around us, the other forces at play around us, right? Ethics is not a purely individual affair. It inevitably concerns itself with the relations between ourselves and other moral agents. And furthermore, Thrasymachus, an opponent of Socrates, early in the dialogue, who doesn't say much after his initial exchange with him, Thrasymachus immediately brings the discussion of justice into the political realm. And that's perhaps the most important point, that Socrates only really begins his discussion on what justice is and why it brings the greatest benefit in answer to Thrasymachus, an answer to Thrasymachus's assertions that justice is worth nothing because the unjust man has a better chance at living a happier life than the just man. And he says that the reality is that there is a right of the stronger over the weaker, and that all political order, or all the various types of political order, all exist merely for the benefit of those at the top. Thrasymachus argues that Socrates can't even tell the difference between sheep and shepherd on this account. And when Socrates asks Thrasymachus to elaborate, he says, quote, "Because you suppose that shepherds and herdsmen study the good of their flocks and herds and fatten and take care of them with some other object in view than the good of their masters and themselves, and don't realize that the rulers of states, if they are truly such, feel toward their subjects as one might towards sheep, and think nothing day and night but how they can make a profit out of them. Your view of right and wrong, just and unjust, is indeed wide of the mark. You are not aware that justice or right is really what is good for someone else, namely the interest of the stronger party or ruler, imposed at the expense of the subject who obeys him." End quote. And then further down he says, quote, "I'm afraid you're very simple-minded, Socrates, but you ought to consider how the just man always comes off worse than the unjust." End quote. So Thrasymachus, as you can probably tell, he comes off as very rude in this exchange. He sort of bursts into the dialogue. He's like described as being almost like a wild animal. And, it's not a surprise since Thrasymachus is from the school of sophists, which were that the word sophist means the experts. In practice, they're like the professional wise men. They were the teachers, the doctors, right? A doctor in an academic sense, whom people paid to learn from, and who were famously denounced by Socrates for being teachers of rhetoric and for the fact that they took payment, and also he thinks they're like wrong about everything. But accordingly, Thrasymachus demands that Socrates pay him for the lesson, and in a somewhat humorous response, when Socrates says he doesn't actually have the money to pay, the other guests in the house they're debating in say they'll pay for Socrates, right? And so Thrasymachus is presented as this petty, greedy, uncouth man, and naturally he presents an argument which we find to be evil, harsh, and pessimistic. And yet it kind of has the ring of truth to it, doesn't it? I mean, if you're a Nietzschean, as we've been discussing, this is the view he gives is not dissimilar to the Sipo Matador description that Nietzsche gives, right? And if we're speaking strictly of realism, right, rather than idealism, we all have that deep, dark thought that ultimately good does not win in the end, and that adhering to a moral code doesn't seem to correspond to actual real-world success. And that oftentimes, people like Stalin, who killed millions to achieve their ends, die peacefully in their sleep. And so Thrasymachus speaks to our darker intuitions, and he's been directly compared to Nietzsche himself, right? Or rather, Nietzsche has been compared to Thrasymachus and to the sophists in general, which we should expect given that they're opponents of Socrates, just as Nietzsche often finds himself as an opponent of Socrates. And I think we have a valid comparison there, by the way. I've seen people argue that Nietzsche should not be considered akin to the sophists or to Thrasymachus. I've also seen another interpretation that Thrasymachus is an embodiment of Nietzsche's conception of ressentiment, that Thrasymachus' seemingly malicious and cruel nature, and his desire to hurt and to seemingly inflict degradation on Socrates and his sort of style of rhetoric actually indicates that he's an anti-Nietzschean presence in the debate. But I think that it misses the mark, because the problem with his reading is it takes the text at face value, right? And not as a work of perspective, as the sort of the confession of Plato, right? The involuntary and unconscious autobiography of Plato, as Nietzsche says. Plato feels that this view that Thrasymachus presents of life being ruled, in actuality by domination and will to power, we might say, and morality or justice as a fiction, Plato considers that to be a bestial, base view of the world. And so he portrays the interlocutor who speaks for it as bestial and base. Nietzsche, in terms of his comportment and style, is nothing like Thrasymachus, but in terms of the ideas that both of them express, I would say Thrasymachus in some ways presents a condensed version of the Nietzschean position. And so at the end of this analysis, we'll call it the Thrasymachien rebuttal to the argument on justice that Plato gives, and to the Platonic ideal state. We'll give the counterpoint that, that because of course Plato never gives a fair counter-argument from the people he doesn't want to portray in a good light. So in any case, Thrasymachus' description that people are made by force to serve their masters, this makes the pursuit of justice sort of like a fool's errand or self-deception, right? And it's in response to these claims that Socrates gives us the analogy of the city, the ideal republic. And so the impetus for the discussion is Socrates answering a political argument. That's when the description of the ideal city begins, is after Thrasymachus has brought things into the political realm. Another argument for why we would take Plato's Republic as a political text is that key to Socrates' argument about the philosopher as the ideal ruler is that the philosopher cannot possibly realize his full potential when he's not put into the position of rulership, and is instead a figure of questionable repute in Greek society, as it stands for Socrates and his contemporaries. Meaning that the pursuit of virtue involves the pursuit of changing oneself, but that includes changing the environment around oneself. And because the surrounding environment affects you and everyone else, the conditions of society can either foster virtue or those conditions can hinder it. And so implicit in the idea that the philosopher can't realize his full potential unless he's placed into the correct social order, we therefore have to say that the societal condition can hinder the ability of people to live just and good lives. And so if you believe in the pursuit of justice, it's your duty in some sense to change those circumstances. And so it's very difficult for me to see how you could ever devolve the arguments put forward in the Republic into a strictly virtue ethics argument on the solely at the individual level. Because implied by the moral code of the text, justice is this totalizing thing that requires, that must be pursued in all aspects of life, right? And so even though the political vision given by Socrates is entirely enclosed within an analogy for personal virtue, the argument, I think, is necessarily political in nature, both in its implications for what the pursuit of justice entails, and insofar as the entire argument is a counter-argument to the political narrative of Thrasymachus, that contrary to what Thrasymachus says, there is an ideal polity, which is not simply, whoever happens to be the strongest polity, right? Or to speak more precisely, that the ideal state, the just state, will actually fare better and be more strongly constituted than the unjust state. And that such an ideal state is not simply the exploitation of one class by another. And while we may see this unideal state of affairs all the time because of man's faultiness and the tendency of all our systems to degenerate, that it is still just that, unideal, right? And so Socrates does indeed posit an ideal political system, and his arguments, in fact, necessitate the attempt to emulate that system as best as possible, because that would represent an attempt to allow everyone to live justly. And because justice does actually lead to the best possible life, that would be the best thing for them. Some do disagree on this interpretation, such as Leo Strauss. Strauss sees Plato's explicit framing of the ideal city as, well, it's unrealizable in reality, and so it can only ever be an analogy, and it demands a strictly ethical interpretation. There's an essay by Alvaro Vallejo Campos. He responds to the Straussian view, and I'm just going to sort of quote from what he says, because even though I feel, given my arguments against the view of it being a strictly ethical text, Campos, I think, puts it very, he gives us a nice succinct paragraph. Quote, "This is equivalent to saying, of course, that Plato does not believe in utopia, and that the just city sketched in the work is just an ironical proposal intended to show the essential limits and nature of the city. I would like to recall Nietzsche's opinion in Daybreak that Plato was, quote, left with the reputation of being a fantasist and utopian, end quote, because success eluded him. But he attempted to settle 3 times in Sicily in order to determine customs and regulate everyone's day-to-day mode of life. And so we can be sure that, for Nietzsche, Plato was an idealist, like many philosophers for whom, quote, existence is unbearable without a utopia, and that, in his view, the project of the just city was possible and desirable for Plato," end quote. So Campos, of course, brings in Nietzsche. The essays, much of it is on Nietzsche and his interpretation of Plato. And I'll link all this in the show notes. The quotation at the end there is from a note of Nietzsche's from the winter of 1869 to 70, where Nietzsche charges that Plato did indeed intend to portray the kind of state that he would wish to see realized, and if it was not realized, it was only because Plato lacked the power to do such a thing. And so Nietzsche obviously would agree with Campos, as I would, in seeing an obtuseness to Strauss's approach. Now, to call the work utopian may seem to then lend credence to Popper's argument, right, to return to Karl Popper. But in counter to that, if we're going to give Karl Popper a charitable read due to his background, maybe we could do the same for Plato, who lived through the period of revolutions against the old social order in ancient Greece that we've discussed when talking about Coulanges' work and in the life of Theognis of Megara, in which the governments of the city-states seemed to cycle between oligarchies who, brutally persecuted those who challenged them in order to hold on to their power. And then there were democratic uprisings where they expropriated the wealth of the rich as soon as they could take power. And then finally tyrants, who sort of riding on waves of democratic energy, would take power under the pretext of being the friend of the people, but then establish, a paranoid autocratic rule characterized by assassinations and, violence. And as always, the friendship to the people was purely transactional, right? The tyrants, we're told by many historians of the era, lived, they lived in constant fear of being overthrown, and they were only really supported by their ability to distribute expropriated wealth to the people, right? So Plato is living through a time when these sort of revolutions have become a common thing throughout the Greek world. And Plato saw how the nobility was often craven. They didn't have the vision or the courage to make the sweeping changes needed to preserve their societies. It wasn't as if he was an ally of the old traditions. But in the case of Athens, the longest running example of democracy among the Greek polis, history had gone in the opposite direction. The democratic government was deposed in a coup, encouraged and supported by Sparta after Athens lost the Peloponnesian War. And so Plato experienced an oligarchic takeover of his society. And after the democratic rule was then later restored, Plato sees his teacher Socrates sentenced to death by a majority vote. And so in short, Plato saw sort of the excesses of the two main competing forms of government, the 30 tyrants, as they're called, and democracy. Now, Plato had a good reason to think that none of the forms of government currently practiced were the ideal. And so perhaps another answer to the charges of Popper is that Plato was very much himself responding to the use of violence over reason in the governance of human beings, right? His entire point in writing the Republic is to demand that reason ought to rule and curb the need for violence thereby, right? And so in practical terms, he tries to achieve this with persuasion rather than force, right? Plato's vision is reason as the presiding faculty over the actions and life of the individual, and yes, as a political ruling class, right, over the state. And it's difficult to argue that this first principle, regardless of how they wash out with their political ideology, as a first principle, it's not really at variance with Popper's own project. It's simply that the two men come to different conclusions. So, now, having established the dimensions of the discussion here, that this is a political text, we're going to treat it as such, that is nevertheless framed within an ethical text, and that it does have utopian ambitions, and that it may be at variance with our modern ideas. I think we've laid out sort of the case for, or the pretext for Socrates' argument to rebuke Thrasymachus' notion that justice is not rewarded with success and that the unjust man is happier. So with all of that groundwork laid, the main argument of the text really is the task of defining justice, and that the idea that justice is in fact a more rewarding path than injustice. It's sort of those two very intensely related questions. And so turning to Nietzsche again, we find here in the idea of reason as the rightful ruler and the good as Plato understands it, and as only a philosopher can understand it, that's like sort of the core dispute between Nietzsche and Plato. When we last visited Plato's work, it was in the Symposium. And when we talked about the Symposium, I tried to take care to show how it is that Nietzsche could have an admiration for Socrates in spite of his rather savage criticism of Socrates as a far more, like famous aspect of Nietzsche's philosophy. But here, when it comes to the Republic, Nietzsche, I think, would have far less positive things to say. It doesn't mean that the ideas contained in the Republic are entirely antithetical to Nietzsche's politics, but Nietzsche's disagreement here is with that central organizing principle, which I think overshadows any apparent similarities between the two. Nietzsche rejects the concept of the good, and furthermore rejects the entire orientation of the project of creating an ideal city based on the idea of the good. And again, the good is sort of the form of good action that an individual might manifest. Same thing as talking about justice, and justice being manifested in the life of a just man, right? And this is more than a mere difference of approach for Nietzsche. To him, it's not a matter of subjective taste, but an indication that Plato is one of the slanderers against life, right? Who charges that life is not all it could be because it ought to be different. And so, as one wishes to impose something, unreal, meaning something which cannot be realized, the result will be that they slander life all the more that they continually fail to realize this project, right? And so we could return to the charge that Nietzsche makes in The Birth of Tragedy, that Socrates was really an artist himself. He makes the exact same charge against Plato, that in spite of Plato's image handed down to us throughout the ages as an advocate for the truth above all things, and the call to seek knowledge of what is truly real and not merely apparent, in crafting this ideal dream image of the city, which can never be realized, that we receive in the Republic, Plato's acted as more of an artist than a philosopher. He's obscured the truth, which to Nietzsche exists in the world of appearance, right? The appearance in terms of the world of the senses, the world that we all live in, right? And Plato has, instead of that, elevated a falsehood above it in order to serve his own aims. And so that's an artistic project, regardless of what you might call it. For Nietzsche, this is ultimately not philosophical. It's the distortion of our reality out of one's own will, which is art. And so Nietzsche does not even seem to have respect for this will of Plato's to create this ideal city, by the way, since he sees he seems to see it as a sign of weakness or cowardice in Plato that he needed such a utopia and could not endure reality without it. So Nietzsche writes in a fragment from 1887, quote, "It is Platonism, who nevertheless had an extra audacity in his reversal. He measured the degree of reality in terms of its degrees of value and said, the more idea, the more being. He reversed the concept of effective reality, Wirklichkeit, and said, what you take to be real is an error, and we come closer to the truth as we get closer to the idea. Do you really understand that? This was the greatest rebaptism, and since it has been taken up by Christianity, we no longer perceive this amazing thing. Plato, as the artist he was, preferred appearance to being, lie and invention to truth, the unreal to the actual." End quote. And so, that's 1887. Of course, the next year, Nietzsche would write Twilight of the Idols, where he gives some of his more insightful critiques of Plato and Socrates. The relevant sections being the problem of Socrates, how the true world finally became a fable, and morality as anti-nature. But here, in this fragment, sort of prefiguring that work, he reveals the situation as he sees it. The problem with Plato, politically, morally, however we want to talk about it, it all flows from the central problem of elevating the ideal above the real. The form of the thing, the idea of the thing, that becomes the reality, and that becomes the repository of value, right? The value becomes vested in the abstract world. And so we can see in the German word Wirklichkeit, what Nietzsche means by effective reality is that in the world of phenomena, the world of the senses, This is the world where we interact with things on a sensory level. It's the world in which being, quote unquote, works, right? Wirklich. So, for Nietzsche, the starting premise of his own philosophy, one could almost say, is that the effective reality is the phenomenal reality, that the world of the senses is the world where action takes place, where wills interact with wills, where we create and do things, destroy things, right? The world of the senses is where it actually and effectively happens, right? But for Plato, the good is held up to be the most effective thing. He inverts that sense, that value sense, right? The good is something which cannot be perceived by the senses. It exists only in the realm of what is intelligible. Being becomes effective, therefore, in the abstract world of the intellect. Nietzsche believes that this was remarkable because it's sort of a revaluation of values, right? That's why Platonism is the precursor to Christianity, because it revolted against the noble master morality, which said that what exists is what is good, right? Whether you like it or not. And so Plato says that what ought to be is good. The ideal state that we can imagine is good, even if it can never be attained. And so morality becomes this judgment on reality itself, because what the good is remains always outside of actual phenomenal reality. Now, according to Nietzsche, morality in this new sense, this new Platonic sense, arises, therefore, when our life force is declining, when our instinct is coming up lacking, is the way he describes it. And so, what was the situation in Plato's day? I mean, the Greek civilization is at the beginning of like a centuries-long decline. It's such a long and slow decline that the people living through it, generation to generation, can't even really perceive it, except in sort of the vague overall sense that things are steadily getting worse. Nietzsche's assertion is that their instincts, their instilled ideas and patterns for how to act and how to behave, are no longer giving them results, right? The traditions that you used to follow that always gave you the same result, the religious beliefs that you acted on unquestioningly, and as long as you're continuing to flourish and thrive, you don't ever question or challenge those instincts. But it's only in this situation, with this series of social revolutions and the sort of general dissolution and change of the morality of Greek society, that you could have a figure like Plato, who emerges and begins to speak of what the ideal city would look like. Whereas, I guess the easiest way to put it is those people of past ages living in Greece, right, lived out their lives without having to articulate reasons for how they lived, living as they did in sort of the waking dream world of the old Greece and its world enchantment beneath the Olympian gods, right? What conversation was there to be had about the nature of the ideal city? They were already living in the ideal city, right? What could be a more ideal city than Sparta or Athens? And so we can understand, if we take this decline of Greece seriously, this whole idea that it was sort of slipping into decay, then Nietzsche might have had a point in that bizarre idea put forward in Birth of Tragedy, that Socrates may have been sort of like the last chance for Greece and a turning point in world history, without whom men would have made a habit of like strangling their friends and relatives as a last act of mercy, right? During like a totally anarchic, murderous collapse of society. And so Socrates, for all his faults, may have prevented this, Nietzsche says, because in the waning cultural sort of direction of Greece, perhaps the adoption of this sort of like rational Alexandrian approach to life was the only sensible alternative. Perish or become absurdly rational, right? That's the argument he makes. And so the entire basis of the Platonic ethical and political program is the rule of reason, right? And near the end of the work, Socrates describes it's often called the tripartite self. We'll just sort of look at this concept now, because I think it's absolutely key to the essence of the Platonic project and to helping us understand how this ideal state is governed. The self as imagined by Socrates is constituted by three things: the intellect, the spirit, and what you might call like the baser urges, right? So man is described in his true inner essence, not as a unity, but a sort of chimera, of various beasts and monsters, these many animal heads that represent the passions or the drives. His spirit or his willpower, and it's also difficult to find one word in English that can describe to us exactly what this aspect of the self is, but basically it's the part of you that can stir your courage, and really I think most of us would call this like the will or willpower. It's often translated as spirit. In any case, this aspect of man is described as a lion. Unlike the other base urges, which are sort of always rebellious and hungry and tyrannical, the spirit can either be made to cooperate with reason and be the very thing that enforces its principles, or it can become rebellious itself and prideful and aggressive and so on. Now, the only part of the tripartite self which is described as a real man, so you have this collection of sort of like bestial urges, you have this lion-like spirit. The real man, the real person, is the intellect, the capacity to reason. This is described as being like the actual human being. That's the part of you that's human. And so the person who does not live in reason and has an improperly ordered self, this makes the real man the essence of what it is to be a human being. That makes it into a slave to animal aspects of who we are. The spirit, which should be the enforcer of the intellect, roars and frightens off the intellect. And this can be described as someone whose, passions are allowed to run wild and who doesn't bring his willpower into alignment with his principles. And so finally, the chimeric urges of the many drives, which should never rule and always have to be controlled, are set loose and become master, or they fight one another for rule over the self. And so Socrates says that injustice is, quote, some kind of civil war between these same three elements, when they interfere with each other and trespass on each other's functions, or when one of them rebels against the whole to get control when it has no business to do so, because its natural role is to be a slave to the rightfully controlling element. This sort of situation, when the elements of the mind are confused and displaced, is what constitutes injustice, indiscipline, cowardice, ignorance, and in short, wickedness of all kinds. End quote. And so to answer the question that is posed to Socrates by Glaucon and Adeimantus and the others, after having been challenged by Thrasymachus, right? Justice is best described really by only a slight alteration from the idea that it's giving every man his due. According to Socrates, it's minding your own business, right? But we could scale up this principle. We can scale it up or down to any level. Another way we could say it, the reason why I say it's very similar to the idea of giving every man his due, but not quite the same. But you could say that it's justice is everything put into its proper place, right? So our attention our focus should be directed to the proper task, according to what function we're fulfilling in society, for example. So on the level of the individual, quote, the just man will not allow the three elements which make up his inward self to trespass on each other's functions or interfere with one another, but by keeping all three in tune, like the notes of a scale, high, middle, and low, and any others there be, will in the truest sense set his house to rights, attain self-mastery and order, and live on good terms with himself. End quote. And so the reason why justice for Socrates is always more profitable than injustice is because anyone who places their base urges as sort of the ruler of their character, who allows that to happen, in his view will not find happiness, and certainly not freedom. That, like, for example, the idea of an outlaw, right? Somebody who lives by no rule or standard, engaging in lying and cheating, the use of force to get whatever you want. It's not actually the image of freedom, that it's the image of someone who's a slave to his own desires. And so the unjust man, as Thrasymachus describes him, is actually a description of someone whose inner self is in a state of civil war, and who has no reason for his actions, and therefore no freedom, to appeal to maybe a Kantian argument from much later, right? But which you could argue is sort of developed here as well. That, someone who lives in this sort of state of internal upheaval does harm to himself and everyone around him, and makes it difficult for everyone to practice virtue in the environment at large. And since virtue is sort of everything being in its proper place and your attention on the proper thing given your function, we might say, or whatever the task at hand is, then this makes everything worse, right? And oftentimes, like when Socrates is speaking about all of society, an unjust society to him would be where you have, the people, like he'll list out professions and he's like, do we want the smith, making like clothing and the seamstresses making like armor, right? No, we would want the people who have the proper expertise and the proper skills, putting those skills to work and putting their attention in the proper way, right? And so we want the people who are best suited to rulership to rule. And, it's worth noting, so one of the disputes in the dialogue is over whether the gods actually reward virtuous, behavior with, rewards in the afterlife, or not, right? This becomes of key importance in the argument where Socrates gives us the myth of as a sort of conclusion to the story, which tells of how the soul will have to drink of the waters of Lethe, or forgetting, right, in order to pass over into the next world. And so that we'll be offered a choice of whether to incarnate into our next life as a great king, or a tyrant, or a criminal, or presumably any number of choices, and without any knowledge of what life is like, having forgotten everything about the world. And so, being a sort of supremely naive soul who has to make this choice, Socrates says that the only thing that we'll bring with us is our habits, right? Whether we've instilled justice into our character through living justly, through right action, habitual right action. And if we haven't done so, we'll be unable to properly make this choice with any wisdom, and we'll choose without a sense for the consequences, right? The reason why Socrates might have to invoke this idea of the immortality of the soul and the rewards of justice is to counter what anyone could see with immediate observation, right? That the Greeks offered sacrifices and offerings to their gods as a form of transaction, whereby the morality or immorality of the person kind of ceases to matter. And many sayings existed, which Socrates cites in the text, to suggest just this, that the gods would help any man who offered sacrifices to them in the proper way. And so while they might from time to time reward a just man or punish injustice or whatever the case may be, that in actual truth, human standards of goodness didn't matter much to the gods. A common proverb is quoted here, called in the text simply a saying of the poets, that, quote, "The gods can be won with gifts, and so can the king's majesty," end quote. In fact, Socrates disagrees with a great many depictions of the character or nature of the gods, which is a large part of the lengthy discussion on the topic of education and what poetry shall be allowed in the ideal republic and what poetry should not be. And that's something that's at least admirable in Plato, I think, from a Nietzschean perspective, is that there's some daring here in this text, right? It's daring to go and attack Homer and Hesiod and all the pillars of Greek literary accomplishment. Socrates sort of goes about and suggests comprehensive revisions of all these great works to remove what he sees as false or misleading depictions on the nature of divinity. One of his problems is the fickleness of the gods, as we mentioned, their willingness to be bought with bribes. Another is the idea that the divine, Socrates asserts, must ultimately be good, and that the good does not do harm to any man. If a good man punishes, he does so only for the good of the one punished. He doesn't do it out of wrath. Wrath is one of those lower base impulses that needs to be curtailed under the rule of reason, right? And so we see Socrates' sort of anti-tragic attitude here when he calls out Aeschylus and he rebukes him on the idea that, quote, God implants a fault in man when he wishes to destroy a house utterly, end quote. For Socrates, this view of the gods bringing down destruction on a human being is unacceptable because the highest divinity, the creative force, the logos that governs all the world, is synonymous with the form of the good. Socrates argues, quote, God, being good, cannot be responsible of everything, as is commonly said, but only for a small part of human life, for the greater part of which he has no responsibility. For we have a far smaller share of good than of evil, and while God must be held to be the sole cause of good, We must look for some factors other than God as the cause of the evil." End quote. And so the problem of evil that you might be familiar with in the form of Christian apologetics, right? Socrates just sort of sidesteps the problem of evil by just asserting that the divine, just quite plainly is not responsible for everything, only for everything good, and that everything evil has to have another cause. This is precisely why he has a problem with the portrayal of the divinities of Greece. They're not depicted as paragons of unreachable virtue, but as possessing many of the same qualities as human beings. The gods are prone to human emotions and affects, not just wrath, but, strong emotions that they allow to overwhelm them, right? Socrates cites, for instance, the lamentations of the goddess Thetis, the mother of Achilles, among a few passages, that he quotes from the Iliad. Quote, "Ah, misery me, the unhappy mother of the bravest of men," end quote. He also criticizes the poets who have said that the gods disguise themselves in the shape of ordinary humans, like Hera, depicted it's in a play now lost, one of the tragedies of Aeschylus, where the goddess Hera is disguised as a priestess begging for alms on the streets. We might also consider the numerous stories where Zeus transforms himself into a beast, like the whole affair with Leda and the swan. Zeus transforms himself into an animal in order to have sex with mortal women. And so, for reasons having to do with the origins of Greek religion, as we've discussed in past episodes, the Greek gods are very much an image of humanity itself, right? Coulange puts it that they were deifying the human will and the world, the human world in some sense. And that's sort of it's precisely the problem in Platonism with the popular image of the divine. The wrath of the gods, the cruelty and in the indifference of nature, rather than a vision of the world in which justice and virtue are rewarded, this sort of accounts for the Platonic attack on the tragic art form. But, to tie this back to the myth that Socrates gives at the end of the work, most importantly, Socrates disagrees on some deep metaphysical level with the idea that the gods dispense reward or punishment transactionally, and that they can be bought with gifts like a king or a tyrant. As we know, the view of the gods as punishing or rewarding based on receiving offerings is a religious notion descended from the days of ancestor worship, and that the view of the dead, that they lived on underground and needed nourishment in the afterlife, and that by pouring out a funerary repast of wine and food, and usually a slain or burnt sacrificial victim like a sheep or a goat, one appeases the dead, and the dead over time become the gods of a locality. The gods exist on the land in which they are buried and protect the land according to whether they're cared for and honored. And so eventually this belief scales up from the family level to the tribe level to eventually the city level. And in time, these patron deities become less associated with ancestors and more so with sort of universally recognized phenomena as they become more universal, right? Astrological deities, nature deities, and so forth. But they're still honored in the same way, right? And that the vestiges of this ancient belief was that it was more important that one follow the exact formula in honoring their deity, the way that it's always been followed, rather than that there was some sort of punishment or reward based on what was in your heart, right? And so what Socrates is articulating here is a sort of revolution of the philosophers in the spiritual realm. These figures beginning with Thales, proceeding through Heraclitus, Pythagoras, Empedocles, and so on. They called into question these old dogmas and presented universal depictions of reality rooted in abstract concepts. And so the reason why this revolution in thought could occur at all was that in comparison to the layering on of incompatible religious concepts over the generations, you have these sort of traditions that have become logically incoherent, and that no one who has inherited these traditions knows the reason for or can articulate. And so Socrates can do things like get his audience to agree that the gods are essentially good and do no harm, right? And yet, look, the poets and tragedians depict them as fallible, capricious, wrathful, morally compromising, and ultimately very human, right? And that's because there's sort of these contradictory beliefs that have grown up over the years. And so the myth that Socrates gives at the end, where virtue is in the ultimate scheme of things rewarded, what Socrates is doing is advancing yet another argument in his metaphysical battle against the idea of gods who are both good and evil, and who therefore might reward injustice, right? Socrates' argument is in some sense premised on the idea that there is a divine orientation in the cosmos toward the good, and that therefore someone like Thrasymachus would be incorrect that the unjust man could ever be happier, because even if the gods may seem to reward injustice in the short term, in the long term, when it's time for you to, drink the waters of Lethe and go on to your next life, injustice only leads to ruin. And importantly, it will be your own choice that leads to your ruin based on your own habits of virtue or lack thereof. And it's not going to be the archetype of the good that punishes you for being unvirtuous, right? It'll be your own choice, your own actions which bring that ruin upon you, right? Because the good doesn't punish out of wrath or anything like that. Now, finally, we'll get to sort of a description of the ideal state as Socrates has laid it out. Socrates shows this tripartite model of the soul in his explanation of the three classes of the Greek state. As he sees it, there's essentially three classes of men in any state. There are the rulers, there are the soldiers, and there are the people who make a living from their labor or by buying or selling, the businessmen and tradesmen, right? Now, in modern and more complex states, it would, of course, be argued that other classes and sort of subclasses can exist. But what Socrates gives us, I think it's fair to say, is the closest thing to a minimum set of categories needed in describing how a state functions. There's the executive function, the sort of decision-making, leadership aspect of society. There's the enforcement, the what would you say? The protection of the social order from within and without, but also just the force that from which the dictates of the executive function sort of flow out into society. And then there is, in the vast majority, the productive function of society, the productive class of society, the laboring class. Now, we can see which division of the soul corresponds to each of these three classes of people. The ruler is obviously correlated with the intellect, the soldier with the willpower or the spirit, and the productive laborers are the impulses, the urges, the desires, and so on. And if that last category or that last sort of correspondence causes any confusion, we should clarify a few things. The final class includes not only the owners of capital, the managers, but also the proletarians. So this is not an economic class distinction that Socrates is making. In fact, it's almost political to the exclusion of the economic. In fact, all the economic class divisions within society, it's sort of taken for granted, should occur within the class of people who are all economic men, right? The Homo economicus is the man of the common people, of the third class of individuals, those who are ruled over. Economic activity only occurs within this sphere. The soldiers do not live with any concern for economic matters, nor do the rulers. They're supported by the productive classes with wealth extracted from them, but and that's considered just in the Platonic scheme, because the productive classes, it's taken for granted, can't govern themselves properly and wouldn't be able to exist even if their existence were not defended by the soldiers. So they need the rulers and the soldiers to rule over them and defend them. Now, the trend that was beginning to happen around this time in Greece, in which people who were rich merchants began to rival the nobility in terms of wealth and even a fair measure of social power, we find the disapproval of Plato for this development as much as in Theognis. The merchants and the laborers are not unlike the base impulses or the desires, because the very work of economics, you could define it by the task of figuring out how to best satisfy human desires. We often speak of economics in terms of need, but I think that's a bit outdated in our modern economy, for one, where most of our immediate needs are met. But it was already mostly outdated by the time of classical economies, where there were already numerous luxury goods exchanged in international trade. But more to the point, Need and want in the economic sense might as well be synonymous, because the price of a good is not set, based on whether you really need it or whether you just want it, right? If anything, if you really need it, it'll be even more expensive. It's set by what people are willing to pay for it, right? And so that's affected by a lot of things, by scarcity of goods, relative quality of goods, and so on. But ultimately, when we speak of economic value, we're speaking of the degree to which something satisfies a need, a want, a desire. The merchant is the one who has the function of fulfilling the desires. The best merchant is the one who fulfills the desires of the greatest many, and therefore makes the greatest profit. And so the entire class of economic people is related to the fulfillment of desires and urges, both the basic needs demanded by our physiology, but also the luxuries and frivolous things that are sought out by our many vices. And so that's why in ancient times, the merchant class was never seen as fit to rule or hold any sway over society. Socrates puts this quite plainly, quote, "It should be clear that love of money and adequate self-discipline in its citizens are two things that can't coexist in any society. One or the other must be neglected," end quote. In spite of this opinion of Socrates, in Plato's time, the merchants did increasingly gain entry into the aristocracy as a type of pseudo-nobility, or even marrying into aristocratic families. And this is, of course, coinciding with the period of the democratic revolutions in which things like birth and bloodline are being eliminated from any special precedents in politics. The argument for why that is that these had sort of lost the religious awe that they had previously held in the eyes of the populace. And so the conflict of that time between oligarchies and democracies and tyrannies, when we interpret it through this lens of this tripartite division of classes, it's a conflict only possible when the third class, the economic class, is allowed to take precedence, which is akin to allowing the base impulses to rule the individual, right? The oligarchies, they also represent a degenerated aristocracy wherein those who become rulers of society are simply those who make themselves the richest, right? And against that sort of aristocratic rule, the masses of people who have very little will naturally rebel and establish a democracy. But of course, since the democratic society and the democratic character is undisciplined and unable to take the necessary, to distinguish the necessary urges from the unnecessary, right? It's such a society, in Plato's view, will not be free from greed, and greedy, ambitious men then will routinely take power. And so that's sort of Plato's theory of the case for why this sort of cycling between oligarchies, democracies, and tyrannies is happening. It's this interaction between the rich and the poor, within these sort of economic classes of people. So we'll go back to the text, where Socrates says, quote, "You're lucky to be able to think of any community as worth the name of state, which differs from the one we are building. Each of them is, as the proverb says, not so much a single state as a collection of states. For it always contains at least two states, the rich and the poor, at enmity with one another. Each of these in turn has many subdivisions, and it is a complete mistake to treat them all as a unity. Treat them as a plurality, offer to hand over the property or power or the persons of one section to another, and you will have allies in plenty and very few enemies." End quote. Now, it's worth asking, in light of this, what the rule of the spirit or of the willpower corresponds to in terms of a form of government, right? In Socrates' analogical argument so far, the spirit corresponds to the class of soldiers, right? So if democracy and oligarchy and tyrannies are just different forms of, the economic classes of men grabbing for power, what does it look like when the soldiers are the ones in charge? And in order to explain this, let's actually delve a little more into the description of what the ideal state would look like, and we can kind of consider what the rule of the soldiers would look like by comparison. So in Socrates' ideal state, this class is known as the guardians, or really the soldiers are the auxiliaries. It's a bit confusing because he initially calls them a type of guardian, but then he says that the guardians proper will actually be the rulers of society. The ones who are tasked with fighting and keeping the peace, the soldiers, the auxiliaries, they'll still be of high quality, but only the absolutely most virtuous among them will be taken up to be raised into rulership over the whole polity. And so, guardians, auxiliaries, whatever. Anyway, so in the ideal state, the productive classes attend to their own business, the carpenters build, the cooks cook, the doctors do medicine, and so on, and they keep their focus on their work and don't turn their attention or their ambitions to gaining rulership or advancing beyond their role. The guardians, broadly speaking, including both the soldiers and the guardians proper, the philosopher rulers, they, meanwhile, live without any private property, no possessions at all. They share everything in kind, and Socrates says that one could enter the house of another without any protest. And to ensure that they will not have any loyalty to anything or anyone beyond each other, they will live an austere and Spartan lifestyle, pun intended, to be compared to the lifestyle of the Spartans, and they'll be raised outside of the family structure, with everyone raising the children in common. And there's to be complete gender equality between them, with men and women allowed to advance as far as their abilities will take them. The children who are to be admitted into the guardian class will be selected from a young age and will pass many stages of education in sort of being brought into this class. And chief in importance in all this process is the exclusion in the course of the guardian's education of any of these, any exposure to any of those works of poetry or drama that might incite a prospective guardian to emotions unbecoming of someone in that role, right? They have to know courage about all things and be above greed or bribery, have no higher loyalty than the loyalty they have to their community. And so we can imagine that a society's class of guardians and auxiliaries will go wrong if it's allowed to permit entry to those who are not able to put their courage, above all things, or if the soldier class is allowed to earn money, or to pursue political ambitions, or to pursue wealth, right? Or if they have higher loyalties to their family than to the state at large. If they're allowed to pass on and inherit wealth, for example, right? This will also inspire that. And so in short, Socrates thinks that such failures to keep the soldier class pure will ensure that they're not anything like his ideal guardians, but rather that they simply become an oligarchy. And so a large part of how he describes oligarchy is that the acquisition of wealth leads to this self-serving defensiveness, right, of this entrenched wealthy class above the good of society at large. They cease to serve their proper function. But as to what the rule of the soldiers would look like, again, Plato, he describes this form of government, he sets this above all of the other sort of types of government like oligarchy and democracy and tyranny, where the economic men are allowed to gain entry into the halls of power. But the rule by the soldiers is what he calls timocracy or timarchy. It's not, strictly speaking, a military dictatorship. It basically, the word timocracy means rule by the honorable, right? It's often noted in translations of the Republic that there's not really a good modern example of what this would look like. It only really makes sense when we look to the example of Sparta. When we said the ideal guardians and auxiliaries will live a Spartan lifestyle, Dorian society was greatly admired by Plato in contrast to the Ionian or Athenian society. And so he sort of sets the rule of the soldiers in the Spartan fashion, we might say, as above the other forms of government that we described. But he looks to the example of the martial society like Sparta, who maintains a class of people who are just soldiers and nothing more. Their needs are provided for by their slaves, the helots, which is in the oldest Greek states the sort of traditional place for the economic class of people, right? The productive classes are simply slaves in the narrow sense of the word. And so the Spartans and the aristocracy, the ruling class among the Spartans aren't, essentially speaking, greedy. That isn't what their culture rewards because they don't live in pursuit of wealth at all. Their essential character of the timarchy is honor as the social capital, right? That what's rewarded is individual ambition. And while it's not a struggle of economic nature, it can still manifest in the political realm and manifest in the economic realm. And so timarchy is an imperfect society, even though it's set above the other forms, because the soldier class, even though they might be more worthy to rule than the common people, they don't have the proper command of reason, right? To keep the lion of the state, the auxiliaries, from becoming prideful and rebellious, and more concerned with individual advancement than the unity of the state. And so the person fit to rule, in Socrates' view, as given in Plato's Republic, it's the person who has the eye for the unity, right? Which is, in a word, justice, right? The person who truly understands justice, who can perceive the intelligible world beyond the senses, which is the only means by which someone can gain a knowledge of the good and the true nature of the good. That person is the philosopher. And so, among the many selected to be guardians, those with the greatest aptitude for the study of philosophy will be, by degrees, sort of initiated into philosophical instruction, and only those who are of the highest quality will become guardians proper, the philosopher-ruler. And with that sort of stroke, Plato not only sets reason in its proper place as he sees it, but ensures that the individualistic conflict for political power is settled in his model. Socrates argues, quote, "Interference by the three classes with each other's jobs and interchange of jobs between them, therefore, does the greatest harm to our state, and we are entirely justified in calling it the worst of all evils." Absolutely justified. But will you not agree that the worst of evils for one's community is injustice? Of course. So that is what injustice is. And conversely, when each of our three classes, businessmen, auxiliaries, and guardians, does its own job and minds its own business, that by contrast is justice and makes our state just. End quote. And so, key to the argument then, sort of throughout the entire Republic, is the education of those who are to enter the ruling class. As mentioned before, that education involves what is often called the censorship of art and poetry. And in fact, this detail is so important that not only does Socrates discuss it near the beginning of the text, but Plato also includes a penultimate section where Socrates feels the need to make additional arguments for the safeguarding of the people from all harmful art. But if we've been following along, we can sort of predict what kind of art he would allow. The artistic expression that Socrates permits is that which is appropriate to each class of people to absorb. And that's because the mimetic quality of art that Socrates asserts, he thinks art allows it to sort of turn someone's emotions in one direction or another, or exaggerate an emotion or smother an emotion. And so, for example, the guardian auxiliaries, when they hear music, should listen to martial, energetic music. It should stir them to activity, or it should be music that allows them to transcend their fear or doubt when going to the defense of their homeland, right? They shouldn't be allowed to listen to music that makes them swoon or be sexually licentious, nor to music which is too mellow or calm. And for what it's worth, Socrates says that no one should be allowed to listen to music that makes you melancholy or sad, because, that's a completely useless and harmful state. It's a waste. We mentioned earlier all the scenes of the poets and playwrights that Socrates would like to have removed, but where he does approve of the words of the poets are where, for example, he praises Homer for writing a scene in which Odysseus strikes himself in the chest and calls his heart to order, saying, quote, "Patience, my heart, you have put up with fouler than this," end quote. And so it's depictions like these that will be allowed in the dramas portrayed in this ideal republic, depictions of heroism, of reason triumphing over the passions, of people being guided by virtue in the face of great evil or temptation. Socrates' attack on art, in a political sense, therefore, it's not a mere side issue that one can therefore sidestep. Nietzsche was correct to see this sort of hostile aspect of Socrates as core to his character, this hostility to the dishonesty of art, or the emotionalism of art, the irrationality of art, we should say. And in saying how we could ever create this ideal republic, Socrates doesn't actually offer much except to say that if a philosopher king ever gained power, the first thing he would do would be to expel all citizens above the age of 10 so that the children could be raised and properly educated. and sort of indoctrinated into the principles that society should be based on. And so many commenters have remarked on the impossibility or improbability of such an arrangement. And of course, it's a bit circular, right? Since it seems the only way you could get a true philosopher king would be to raise him according to this formula, but the only way you could raise him according to that formula is if you already have a philosopher king, So, all that aside, very impractical, but notice what it says about Socrates' view, that the explanation he gives as to how you could realize it would be, well, the only way you could really do it is if you had children to sort of educate and mold into your ideal image from the time that they were very young, right? And so there's an absolute centrality of education in the Socratic political project. And the reason for that is because the most important thing is having the proper person in the position of rulership. And it's in that way that Plato addresses himself to the oldest political philosophical question, right? Who should rule? And to his credit, he attempts to create a political theory that is geared towards ensuring the rule of the correct person. Like, the reason why it's so difficult to imagine the implementation of such a system is that Plato is here elevating the person above the system, or the character of the people ruling above individual policy prescriptions, right? His primary concern is that the proper people occupy those three classes of society and have their focus solely on their duties as a functionary of that class with the aim of the unity of all society. And so the only way to do this would be to shape and mold the minds of the people who will take their positions in these classes towards those ends. And so that's why the implementation, of his program seems to be so onerous and suspect to us moderns, because it involves all this sort of conscious manipulation of people's intellectual development. But it's because he thinks shaping and molding the people is the only way that you get proper governance. But I think scarcely do we confront how we do exactly the same thing today by instilling our own values into the coming generations. And the argument from the Platonist would be, you don't really have a choice as to whether you're educating the upcoming generation in accord with a set of principles. The only question is which one, or which set, right? And so the censorship of the Platonic regime is part of this broader goal of education. And we approve of censorship ourselves just as well, insofar as we wouldn't want, in the public education system, you wouldn't want a teacher indoctrinating kids into some form of religious fundamentalism. That's against the values of secular society and what the law says can be funded by taxpayer money. So we censor things too in the course of our social system for educating the youth, insofar as we determine what is and what isn't acceptable, what we do and don't want to influence their thoughts and feelings, right? If we thought everyone was a perfectly rational agent that could make up their own minds, parents wouldn't care what their children are exposed to, but they do, because they know they are malleable. And so, people still bristle today against the Platonic idea of the noble lie. And that's kind of a sloppy translation, by the way. What Plato really speaks of is better translated by the phrase magnificent myth, or something of that nature. It's funny because people get really bent out of shape about this. But, none of us modern people believe in Greek mythology anymore. So all of the founding myths of Greek city-states were just magnificent myths, right? We can all admit that now. They were untrue fables and stories that gave the citizenry an identity and made them strong enough to create a social unity and fight for it. If anything, what people take issue with, I think, is maybe the conscious element involved, that Plato is arguing for reason as a ruling principle, but has the ruler, foster a falsehood, right? Consciously foster a falsehood. But in the interest of charity, let's just say from a Nietzschean perspective, maybe this is the most realistic and sober prescription from Plato, that people need a world enchantment in which to live, and that they have fashioned these things for themselves piecemeal through an unguided process already, right? And that if we were to suppose that the most worthy people in existence be allowed to guide this process of myth-making, this process which we already do, then we could perhaps guide the people to fashion a myth that when followed makes them the better for it, right? And I don't think there's necessarily, it's hard for me to, it's like, where's the lie and the idea of the noble lie, right? So it's sort of a Socratic compromise between the absolute demand for reason and the reality that life is premised on falsehood. And maybe it's that apparent contradiction that people like to point out in Socrates. But Socrates calls this a fairy tale, like the ones that the poets tell. And he says that the people shall be told that, quote, the upbringing and education we have given them was all something that only happened to them in a dream. In reality, they were fashioned and reared, and their arms and equipment manufactured in the depths of the earth. And the earth herself, their mother, brought them up when they were complete into the light of day, so that now they must think of the land in which they live as their mother, and protect her if she is attacked, while their fellow citizens they must regard as brothers born of the same Mother Earth. End quote. So Socrates, interestingly, draws on some of the same themes of the ancient religion, in which the gods within the earth are one's literal ancestors, and the plot of land is something that you are tied to, right? Only here, it would be land common to the entire community rather than individual to each family, right? Which is maybe the myth that Socrates is giving here, it's not so much subversive because it's a myth, right? But because of the unity it establishes between all the people of the polis. So it's like people get bent out of shape over the fact that it's a quote-unquote noble lie. It's not the lie part that really would have been scandalous to the other Greeks. It's the fact that he's promoting this idea of this common unity and common ancestry, common descendants that breaks up and smashes the traditional familial religions and those old beliefs upon which society was premised. So everyone is seen springing from one common Mother Earth, and all are brothers, even though they're slotted into different social positions. And so the unity of society, its harmony, is the principle at work here. He continues, quote, you are, all of you in this community, brothers. But when God fashioned you, he added gold in the composition of those of you who are qualified to be rulers, which is why their prestige is the greatest. He put silver in the auxiliaries, and iron and bronze in the farmers and other workers. End quote. And Socrates even goes on to include here, as a sort of pretext for why children will be seen as the common property of the entire community, and why parents shouldn't be allowed to form individual nuclear families outside of the larger family structure. He says, quote, now since you are all of the same stock, though your children will commonly resemble their parents, occasionally a silver child will be born of golden parents, or a golden child of silver parents, and so on. End quote. And so he doesn't want these different classes to rigidify into something that's handed on by bloodline, but sort of people's meritocratic ability cultivated through education will be the determining factor into where someone is slotted. And so that requires that people sort of have a superseding identity above their family identity. He goes on to say that if anyone attempted to bribe or win the heart of one of the guardians by offering him gold, such a person would not care for such a bribe because they would have been raised in the belief that they already have the true gold within them. They don't need such false gold, right, as the physical gold now offered. And so in his sort of editing of the mythos of the Greeks, Socrates reveals a series of political principles that the myth is intended to serve. And remember, this myth is basically it's one of the foundational or the pillars of what he's calling education here. How you educate people into this ideal republic is you teach your children about who they are and what's most important in life. Right? And this is the first principle for why the leaders are above economics and why they have to be willing to forgo individual ambition for the good of the collective, right? Or for the good of the social unity, and why the family structure has to be subordinated to the political project. And so by making education of primary importance as he does, Socrates' political philosophy has to be understood as capitulating to the notion that culture or ideology or whatever you want to call it, basically the stuff that's in all of our heads, is where the social change has to first be affected. You can tinker with systems, but this won't change anything so long as the wrong people with wayward desires and unchecked ambition are allowed to compete within those systems. And if the proper barriers and divisions in society are not established according to these principles, it's going to be chaos, right? Where you have not one state, but multiples, which can be turned against one another, right? And so education is of chief importance once again, and therefore reason emerges as the proper governor. It's by those who are the wisest taking charge of the education of the coming generations that the society's entire political structure can be based upon, right? This is the power that this text recognizes in education, and this attitude, it accounts for all the illiberalism in regard to art, poetry, drama, and culture in general. Everything has been sublimated to the one goal of allowing the good to flourish and create a just society. And so the unity of the good ends up reflected in this unity of society and in reason as the rightful ruling principle in all things. And that culminates in the Allegory of the Cave, the most famous aspect of the Republic, in which reason alone is declared as the faculty able to comprehend the real content of the world, the intelligible content of the world. Just to go over it briefly, I think we all know it, but the Allegory of the Cave, it's the story of a bunch of prisoners chained beneath the ground, only able to see the shadows on the cave wall. These are shadow puppets sort of cast by various objects held before a fire, right, by their captors who are standing behind them. And these men have never seen the light of day, and they're so constrained that they can only behold these shadows. And so they take the forms that they see projected on the wall for real men and, people, animals, events, and so on and so forth. But the shadows are, in Socrates' words, an analogy for the world that we represent to ourselves with our own senses. The man who escapes this cave and walks out into the light of day represents the wise man, the philosopher. And while his eyes are first blinded, he eventually adjusts to the light of reason and perceives this intelligible world, the only world where real knowledge can exist. Because to Plato and Socrates, real knowledge is knowledge of being. Being that which endures, right? And what truly endures are the patterns, the paradigms of all that which exists, which themselves never arise or pass away, and which are only approximated by the various phenomena. The phenomena are the things that arise and pass away, but the sort of pattern is the most real thing because it endures beyond any one of them. And so the man who learns to distrust his own senses like this in favor of the abstract world of reason is considered to be the wise man. And so in any case, the form of the good, right? Unity is an essential aspect of it because the form of the good, unlike any individual approximation of good or right action, or a good or just thing, or good or just set of circumstances, or a good or just system, will never fully, imitate the good in, it's in the highest ideal, in the actual form of the good. It will only ever be an imitation. But nevertheless, this view of the good or the just, or however we want to call it, it inevitably would be a unity if fully realized, because it is everything in its right place, as the Radiohead lyric goes. There would inevitably be no conflict or dissension, right? It would be sort of everything acting in harmony. And so Plato creates what Heidegger calls the suprasensible world. It's a wonderful term for Plato's true world. It's that which is above and prior to all sensation. And it should be said that I don't think Plato begins from the position of sort of wishing to downgrade that which appears, but from wishing to elevate reason. But the result, all the same, is idealism, or however we want to call it, both idealism in the sense of rejecting materialism, but also in the sense here of political idealism. Plato passes judgment on life, right? He passes judgment on the world of appearance in which we live and on the pursuit of phenomena as objects of our desires. But he also passes judgment on the political reality in which we live in favor of this unattainable idea of a perfect societal unity. And so Nietzsche's main criticism for the political philosophy of Plato and Socrates is, as we've said, that it's a condemnation of nature and that the measure of the value of existence becomes based on an approximation to this suprasensible world. The abstract becomes more real than the real, right? And so from the Nietzschean stance, Plato's Republic is inevitably utopian in all the derogatory senses of that word. It's a political philosophy which is untenable for numerous reasons. I mean, the fact that we have to say, set practicality aside in order to actually speak of the thought experiment, right? But, beyond the strict practical, the arguments of strict practicality, we could simply say, from a Nietzschean perspective, that Nietzsche asserts an impossibility of the governance of either one individual or an entire state by use of reason. Because, and this is really the big critique, for Nietzsche, reason is a weapon in service of one of our drives. Our drives pursue what it is that they value, and pure reason doesn't provide us with values, because valuations are pre-rational. And so whereas Plato would have seen the intellect as being prior to the senses, we might say, Nietzsche would say, if not the senses, something physiological, instinctual, pre-rational, which is prior to reason, right? And so this political program of Plato's is just as unrealizable for Nietzsche as it would be, as he would say the ethical program is, right? The call of the intellect, the real man to subdue the lion of the spirit, right? And use it to tame the base impulses. The intellect for Nietzsche is always at the service of the will. And Plato's Republic is therefore not only impracticable, but also undesirable. And yet we can see how in Plato's recognition of a number of things, like the need for stratification in society in order for it to function properly, the importance of myth and poetry and art for shaping minds, the orientation of political philosophy around the question of who should rule rather than tinkering with systems, there is some common ground with Nietzsche and Plato, right? And Nietzsche, Plato, and Theognis all agree in sort of charging that there's a calamity involved when you use wealth as a measure of social or political status. Arguably the most approving note Nietzsche sounds of Plato's political philosophy is found in the essay The Greek State. We've peeked into this essay in a previous episode, but we're going to quote from the final paragraph at the end of this fragment. Again, this was meant to be appended to the end of The Birth of Tragedy, or as a part of The Birth of Tragedy, as sort of a political philosophy section, which Nietzsche ultimately did not include, so it remains this fragment in his notes. But Nietzsche says that Plato's ideal republic is, quote, something still greater than even the warm-blooded among his admirers believe, not to mention the smiling mien of superiority with which our historically educated refuse such a fruit of antiquity. The proper aim of the state, the Olympian existence and ever-renewed procreation and preparation of the genius, compared with which all other things are only tools, expedients, and factors toward realization, is here discovered with a poetic intuition and painted with firmness. Plato saw through the awfully devastated Herma of the then existing state life and perceived even then something divine in its interior. He believed that one might be able to take out this divine image, and that the grim and barbarically distorted outside and shell did not belong to the essence of the state. The whole fervor and sublimity of his political passion threw itself upon this belief, upon that desire, and in the flames of this fire he perished. That in his perfect state he did not place at the head the genius in its general meaning, but only the genius of wisdom and of knowledge. That he altogether excluded the inspired artist from his state. That was a rigid consequence of the Socratian judgment on art, which Plato, struggling against himself, had made his own. This more external, almost incidental gap must not prevent our recognizing, in the total conception of the Platonic state, the wonderfully great hieroglyph of a profound and eternally to be interpreted esoteric doctrine of the connection between state and genius." End quote. And so, again, there's something admirable in Plato's Republic, even for Nietzsche, and that Plato seems to recognize that connection between state and genius insofar as the state is the framework that allows you to use, what does he say? The preparation and procreation of genius is the thing compared with which all other things are only tools, expedients, and factors towards realization, right? And so the production of geniuses, that's the capital of culture, as we've discussed to great lengths in talking about Nietzsche's political philosophy. And so at least Plato understands that these extraordinary individuals, right, will be the ones who will become the philosopher ruler, right? It's simply that Plato gets it wrong with his narrow focus on the intellect as the highest faculty. The Socratic anti-artistic tendency is regrettable, and Plato accordingly places only the intellectual genius as the sort of the point or the end of the state, the entire end of society, right? And he fails to recognize that there might be other forms of genius beside that. Now, on the other hand, for all of Nietzsche's praise of Plato, where it may exist, perhaps the most damning remark of all is found in Twilight of Idols, where Nietzsche says quite bluntly, "Plato is boring." This remark actually shouldn't really surprise us because Plato is perhaps the most important author in the study of all antiquity, and he had been, that had been the case for a very long time in the academic world of classicism and philology. So taking issue with Plato when studying ancient Greece is sort of like taking issue with Confucius when studying ancient China. Whatever your opinion is on these men, they're so central to any study of their literature or culture of their, contemporary periods and the effect that followed them was so great, right? That in some sense, their merits or their faults don't really matter. However silly you might find his ideas, Plato rules, right? And that's the tyranny of Plato on the academy. And I think Nietzsche was always sort of in rebellion against that. And that's why he calls him boring. The strongest attack against him is exactly the fact that we all had to read Plato's Republic in school. Nietzsche says at the beginning of Wanderer and His Shadow, quote, "Spare me from contrived wire-drawn dialogues. If Plato had taken less pleasure in them, his audience might have taken more pleasure in Plato," end quote. Nietzsche, gives a rather good summary of all he finds wrong in Plato's philosophy in Twilight of Idols, in the same section where he calls him boring. And, I should say that this is later Nietzsche, whereas the Nietzsche writing in the period of the Greek state when he was giving a compliment to Plato, that's earlier Nietzsche. So perhaps the difference in what Nietzsche might emphasize is also sort of a function of his own development of thought. Nietzsche writes, quote, "In reality, my distrust of Plato is fundamental. I find him so much astray from all the deepest instincts of the Hellenes, so steeped in moral prejudices, so pre-existently Christian. The concept good is already the highest value with him, that rather than use any other expression, I would prefer to designate the whole phenomenon Plato with the hard word superior bunkum, or if you would like it better, idealism. Humanity has had to pay dearly for this Athenian having gone to school among the Egyptians. In the great fatality of Christianity, Plato is that double-faced fascination called the ideal, which made it possible for the more noble natures of antiquity to misunderstand themselves and to tread that bridge which led to the cross. And what an amount of Plato is still to be found in the concept church, and in the construction, the system, and the practice of the church." End quote. That section is particularly interesting, where he's talking about what he owes to the ancients, because immediately after writing that, Nietzsche tells us that he actually has a cure for Platonism, or you might call it an antidote. that he finds within another Greek writer, and that is Thucydides, often called the first true historian. We're going to wrap up our discussion on Plato with Plato's Republic on that note, but next week we're going to take a journey into the world of Thucydides and discover why he thought that Thucydides was sort of the palate cleanser for Plato. So I don't know if I really got into every point about Plato's Republic that I wanted to this week, but I think the general ideas of like how Nietzsche would interpret Plato's Republic, I think I got those across while giving this sort of overall picture of what the book is about. And, so I don't know, give me your feedback, because as I said at the beginning, it's very ambitious to try and cover such a big topic in one episode. Hopefully we did it justice. And if not, if I did it injustice, I hope I'll sufficiently cultivate just habits to, pick a better next life once I drink the waters of Lethe. All right. Goodbye, everybody. Signing off. If you enjoyed the Nietzsche podcast or found it helpful, you can visit us and support the show at patreon.com/untimely-reflections. The link is in the description. Or just share the show with any of your friends that you think might enjoy it, or on social media. Thank you for your support.